It's great being here. When I received the request to talk today, I was actually at a leadership conference in New Orleans, and I received an email from CBMC asking me to think about speaking for this luncheon. I remember waking up, I got that email early in the morning, and I really just put a pause on it. I didn't really think about it too much. Went down to breakfast. So this was a business leadership summit where there are speakers like John Maxwell and John Gordon, and there were people all over the country, business leaders all over the country. I didn't know a single person. It was a great opportunity, but I go down to breakfast, and as I sit down at a table with people I don't know, a guy comes up and sits right next to me and introduces himself, really energetic, very happy to be there. He introduces himself. He's the president of CBMC International. I said, okay, God, I guess I am speaking at that CBMC luncheon. So, in the reason, though, that I would give it a pause at least, whether or not speaking, a couple of reasons, but primarily, all the things that Mike talked about, read my bio, those are the things that we want people to know about us. Those are the things that look well, our successes, our achievements. And this conversation is not really that. I'm going to be talking about some messy stuff. I'm going to talk about my story. And some of it is, it can be hard to hear, it can be hard to talk through, but for reasons that will probably be evident, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to talk. As Mike said, if we haven't met, my name is Jeshua Lauka. I'm an attorney and owner at David Wiringen Lauka, a business law firm downtown. I've got my partner Jim here and one of my colleagues at my table, Jake. And I'm married to my wife, Annie. We've been married for going on 20 years. We've got 4 wonderful kids, Isaiah, Nolan, Tate, and Elsa, ages 17, 14, 12, and 10. And we've been in West Michigan for going on 12 years. I'm not from the area. I grew up in Saginaw, Michigan. And if some of you know about Saginaw, there's some nice parts about it, like most cities. There's also a lot of not great parts about it. Saginaw, a couple years ago, had the ranking of being the #1 city in the country with crimes against women per capita. A lot of those places were in some of the not great parts of town, and those were primarily the places that I grew up in my early years. So if I think about my earliest memories growing up, my earliest memories were living with my mom and my 3 brothers in a relative's basement. At the time, my mom and my dad were married. My mom was a high school dropout. She was waiting tables to try and take care of us. My dad was also a high school dropout. He was never around. My dad was a heroin addict. He was a drug dealer. My dad's side of the family struggled with drug addiction. My dad was a drug addict until he died about 22 years ago. His brothers, to my knowledge, struggle with drug abuse. My mom's side of the family, alcoholism. My dad, some of the earliest memories that I have about my dad, I remember thinking, my dad would come visit, and I remember thinking that as a kid, your parents are married, but dads just don't live with their kids. And I remember when he would come visit, and sometimes he would take us places like the car wash, take us to a car wash, remember that. Sometimes he would take us to his girlfriend's house, and this is while he was married to my mom. Sometimes he would visit, and things would get violent between him and my mom. I remember the yelling. I remember the tears. My dad was in and out until probably I was around the age of 5 or 6, and then he just stopped coming around altogether. Some of it because he was in prison. But over the years, my teenage years, I saw my dad in person maybe 1 or 2 times, talked with him on the phone a couple of times, but largely not there. My mom, I love my mom. My mom died 2 years ago. Mom, I know my mom did the best that she could with what she had. My mom also made a lot of poor decisions, particularly with men. So I am one of 5 kids from my mom. my oldest brother, he's my half-brother. My mom never married his dad. I have a brother who's a twin brother, and I have a brother who's a year younger. And my mom was married and divorced to our dad twice. And I have a younger sister who's a half-sister. My mom was married and divorced to my sister's dad. I remember a time when I was probably early elementary school, so maybe first or second grade, and we were visiting my grandma's house. It was the house that my mom spent her teenage years in. I loved my grandma. My grandma was probably some of the best memories of growing up as a kid. My grandma was a lot of fun. She loved us, and she was very inappropriate. She just was. I remember when my wife-to-be, when I introduced my grandma, she was pretty shocked, in a good way, but just saying, your grandma's not like other grandmas. Okay. But anyway, I was going back to first or second grade at my grandma's. We were snooping around the house, looking at stuff, and going into the room that my mom grew up in, her bedroom, and going in the closet, just looking around, going way back into the recesses of the dark part of the closet and pulling something out. And it was a picture of my mom in a wedding dress with this wedding announcement and a strange last name. And I remember asking my Mom, what is this? And so she explained to us, before she had any of us kids, she was married. She was married to a man who kept a shotgun next to his bed at night so she wouldn't leave. My mom did not make the best decisions with men. But eventually, as my dad was out of the picture around the age of 5 or 6, my mom started seeing other men, and she ended up marrying my sister's dad. She ended up marrying a man who had just as broken of a background as she had in a lot of different ways. If you didn't know that vulnerable people attract other vulnerable people, vulnerable people also attract predators. And we unfortunately experienced that as kids growing up. So my mom married my sister's dad. My sister was born to that relationship. And it was early on after my sister was born that she started exhibiting some strange behaviors. And eventually we would come to realize that probably from the time she was born, my sister was being abused by her biological grandfather, her dad's dad. And that caused a lot of chaos growing up. Growing up, life was chaotic. My older brother was he was violent towards us, violent towards my sister's dad. They would get into fights. One time I remember my sister's dad threw my older brother through a wall. He had to go to the emergency room. After that, CPS came, investigated. Nothing was really done with that. My sister, growing up a young age, she was just always struggling with fits of rage, reliving the trauma. The things that her subconscious had hidden to protect her would come out. And so the result, she was violent towards us, violent towards herself. House was chaotic. Several members of my family, siblings, had to be institutionalized against their will. I remember one time when the police came to take one of my siblings away. That sticks with you. Things they didn't get better. As it relates to my sister's dad, you just stayed away from him. Wherever he was, you just weren't. That's how you dealt with that. But eventually, things got so chaotic around the time that I was a young teenager. I was 14, and I just remember things were always escalating. You probably wouldn't know it from the outside because things were kept up in wraps pretty good by my sister's dad, that everything is going fine. But things were chaotic, older brother being violent, acting out, sister acting out. My younger brother at the time was getting in fights at school, committing crimes, had to tour juvenile hall at least once. And my mom really didn't know what else to do. She didn't have a safety net. So one day she just said, "This is madness and I'm taking my kids to church." Now up until that point, church was not a regular part of our life and I wanted nothing to do with it. As a 14-year-old, the people that I spent my time with, kids I played sports with. I remember the night my mom said, we're going to church. And so it was, there was a pastor that when my dad and my mom were really young, they knew somehow, and she tracked him down to this small church in the inner city of Saginaw, a not great part of town, and she said, that's where we're going. And a Thursday night, I remember, because I was at school, and I was at lunch, and my friends, all the guys that play football with, one of them asked me, what are you doing tonight? And I said, I'm going to church. My mom is making me go to church. It was kind of ridiculous to me. They thought so as well. Church wasn't a part of the life of my friends growing up that I knew of. So at the time, I would look back and say at the time, I wouldn't have identified then, but I was definitely an agnostic. I thought there had to be a God that created everything, but certainly that God wasn't knowable. Certainly didn't care about what was going on in my life or my siblings' lives. But my mom, I remember that night taking us to church, walking through the doors, feeling unsafe walking through the neighborhood, going into this church and hearing loud music, and I honestly, I didn't get it. I did not understand why people would choose to spend an evening or a morning singing songs and hearing somebody talk about an old book. It just didn't make any sense to me. And my mom, to her credit, she kept making us show up. And eventually, as I was sitting in those pews, I began to hear about the pastor talk about Jesus. And Jesus intrigued me. And so sitting in the pews, having nothing else to do, I'm just sitting there, I decided to grab the Bible in the pew in front of me and go to the part that talks about Jesus. Okay, I'll learn about who this is. And it was through reading that I encountered the God of the universe who came down from heaven to be with people like me. I was a nobody from a family of nobodies, and that's who Jesus spent his time with. He spent his time with the poor, the outcasts, the drunks, the prostitutes. And I saw a God that wanted a personal relationship with people and would die with people so they could be with him forever. All of this was confusing to me, and it was going through my mind as my mom kept making us go to church. And ultimately, at some point, I came to this conclusion in my mind. If there was a God, and I believe there was a God, and if that God loved people so much, if that God loved me so much, that he came down to heaven, from heaven to be with me. He wanted a personal relationship with me so that I could be in a right relationship now and forever with God. That was the most awesome reality in existence. And I remember accepting Jesus Christ as my Savior, and God radically changed the trajectory of my life. One of those books of the Bible, as I talked about, I opened the Bible in the pew in front of me. The book of John really gravitated towards me. I loved that because it all talks about Jesus. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him won't perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." I look back, surrounded by drug addiction, alcoholism. My dad died from his drug addiction, poverty, mental illness, abuse. God made a way in my life where there was no way. That's it. Now, did that mean that when I became a Christian, things were perfect? No, not at all. Far from it. But I distinctly remember at that moment having this one thought. Now I'm never going to be alone. And I can tell you that the 28 years since then, it's been 100% true. And I would say that during that time, particularly through the hardest times, God's been the closest. And it's interesting how you can look back and see ways that God was actively at work. God was with me. God was near. I look back and can see some of those things. Like, for instance, sometimes when I share a little bit about my background, people will just ask the question, how did you ever get to college, let alone law school? And I think about that, and I think that's a fair question. And as I look back, like I said, I have 4 kids. When my kids were young, I loved reading to my kids. My youngest right now is 10, so she still lets me read to her a little bit, but mostly she just reads to me. All my kids are great readers. when I went to school, so kindergarten I got held back. And when I went to young fives, I remember the teacher trying to assess what we knew and giving me words to see what words I knew, and I didn't know a single word. I remember her, she had this sheet, she was probably showing a one-letter word like A or I and saying, you've got to know this letter, you've got to know this word. And I said, I don't know any words. But as I started learning, I started getting taught, what came evident to me was learning actually comes pretty easy. And I really liked learning. I really liked reading particularly. So all of that, going through elementary school, 5th grade, I take an advanced placement test and place into advanced classes through middle school. And so as I look back, the people that were in my classes starting in middle school, they were all people that largely came from well-educated families. Very professional families. I remember going to some of their houses to do projects and thinking, wow, I didn't know this part of town existed. Wow, it was just nice neighborhoods. But so all of that to say, there was this expectation through middle school, through high school, you just go to college. That's what you do. And so I thought, I'm going to college. Okay. I didn't ask the question how I was going to pay for college. That's a whole other story. But so I also saw I can look at instance in high school. There's a time in high school that I have to say I can't describe any other way than just God saved my life. So the situation was I was with my friend. We were at his house and we were driving over in his car to pick up his girlfriend and her friends to hang out. And so we picked them up and I got in the back of the car so that his girlfriend could sit in the front and our two friends could sit where there were seatbelts were. I'm a guy, I was trying to give the seatbelts to the girls, and so the middle seat where I sat had no seatbelt. So we're driving back, we go to his house, we're hanging out a little bit, and this was the late 90s when the internet was new, and so I was just sitting on his computer surfing the internet for a little bit, and he came to me and said, Jeshua, I'm going to take his girlfriend and their friends back to her house. And then he said, do you want to stay here with my parents? And I thought, why would I want to stay here with your parents? You're taking the girls with you. But I still sat there and I said, okay, I'll stay here with your parents. And I did. I just stayed there. And eventually he came back, and he came back with his girlfriend, and they were really shaken up. What had happened was when they were driving to take her back to her house, they were driving down a road that had deep ditches on either side. And there were trees lined up on either side of the highway, of the road. And a possum came out right in front of him. He swerved and ended up rolling over into that ditch. And a couple of things happened that I would say are just miracles. One, they ended up in the section where there was just no trees. The only section there were no trees they landed in. The other thing is they all were in seatbelts, and so they were all okay. If I was with them, I would have sat in the seat with no seatbelt. My head would have gone through the moonroof. God saved my life. Through high school by and large, it was a good experience. It was a good time for me. I did well in academics. Sports played a really big important part of my life. I think they're really important. Sports are, particularly with people with my background, with not a great family life. And football particularly, I was very lucky to play with a really good team. My high school, we were a big high school, had a really good football team my senior year. I was a captain on the football team. And one of my teammates went in to have a nice NFL career. We had success as a team. I had individual success, but the greatest thing that happened for football was, it's a competitive sport. Lots of people try out. The way it just ended up, I ended up my senior year starting on the defensive line right between my two brothers. My younger brother was a defensive end. I was a defensive tackle. My twin brother was a nose guard. So when we were on defense, more likely than not, you would hear Lauka on the tackle. It was fantastic. It really was. It was a great experience. But the other thing that through as I was growing and through high school, one thing that God did do is he started developing me purpose. I would call it purpose and passion. I knew that I was passionate particularly about justice for people who were vulnerable like I'd experienced as a kid. And I also was passionate about law. I wanted to study law. I loved learning, and I knew I wanted to go to law school. So I am the first lawyer in my family. Although my family has a very extensive relationship with the legal system. I am the first lawyer in my family. You know, I remember being maybe first grade or so, and my mom came to us with the local paper and said, "Look, boys, your dad's in the paper." My dad was being sentenced to prison for his criminal drug enterprise. I remember a time in law school. It was actually my first year of law school. Law school, if you don't know, it's a very intensive first year, a lot of reading. I was just taking a break, and I remember, all right, I'm just going to scroll through some headlines, some national headlines, and one caught my eye. It said something in the nature of Michigan judge hands man unique sentence, and I thought, okay, I'll take a look. And it was the situation was there was a guy going around to local scrap yards, and he was asking for donations because he was contributing to a veterans fund. He really wasn't doing that. He was taking the money and he was pocketing it. And so as a part of his sentence, the judge handed out a unique sentence to him. The judge made him go to the local veterans monument downtown wearing a placard that said, "I cheated veterans," and he had to scrub that monument with a toothbrush. And as I look at the picture, and this happened in Saginaw, where I grew up. Look at the picture. I started out by saying my earliest memories were living with a relative in their basement. Yeah, that was a picture of Uncle Phil. Yeah. My mom was pretty embarrassed. But even it was about 5 years ago that I was speaking to a group of kids at the Potter's house. And right before I went, my mom sent me a text message. It was a link to an article, and she wanted me to, it was a mugshot from my cousin. My cousin was on the loose. Be on the lookout for so-and-so, armed and dangerous. But as I went through college was a good time for me to get away from home. I hear sometimes people say when they go away to college, they get homesick. I never got homesick. It was a great time of my life. But during that time period, I began to experience what I can only call that I had this gap problem in my life. And maybe you can relate. So I'll give you an example of kind of where I first saw this. I met my wife-to-be, Annie, when we were juniors. And when I met Annie early on, I knew that she was the one that I was going to marry. I knew that she was the one for me. And she also knew as well. And she would say, it took me forever to propose to her. She'd be right. It did. It took me a long time. And here's the reason. Annie had a very different background than I did. Annie grew up in a good family. Not perfect, but good. She grew up in Christian education through high school. She grew up in the church that her dad was still an elder at the same time. Her dad was a very successful business owner, man of integrity, very influential in Lansing. I knew that the man who was going to be the husband to Annie and the father to her children, the standard was way up here. I knew that's where the bar was. And I knew me. I was way down here. I didn't know the first thing about being a husband or a father. The only examples I had growing up were what not to do. So what do we do when we know what we're called to be is way up here, and when we're honest with ourselves, what we are is way down here? What do we do with that gap? I've experienced this gap problem multiple times throughout my life. The legal industry is interesting because in my professional life, the legal industry has some of the highest statistics of alcoholism, drug addiction, depression, suicide. My wife sometimes asks me, how did God ever place you in this role, knowing your background? I don't know. When I read an article about the why behind that, statistically why, and the conclusion was, well, why are there such high statistics? Well, in a profession where the pressure to succeed is at an all-time high, when people ultimately don't get to what they call success, the results sometimes can be coping skills, medicated, addiction. There's a speaker that, an author named John Eldredge, who's wrote a couple of books, Wild at Heart, Fathered by God, a couple of them. And he kind of identifies it as, he says that people, but men in specifically, we have this question that we ask. It burns in us, and it goes something like this: do I have what it takes? Do I have what it takes? What tells us that we have what it takes? So I look back, and a couple of things that we can do. Well, when we have that gap problem, well, we can try and pull ourselves up from our bootstraps and say, I got this. Look at me, world. I am somebody. I'm a somebody. I can do this. I'm important. I'm successful. All of those things. But what ultimately happens is we never reach that bar. The goalpost keeps on moving. The other thing that we can do is we can acknowledge our gap. We can say, I don't have it all. I'm comfortable with my uncomfort, I'm secure with my insecurity. And we can let God fill that gap. I've seen it play out, going back to my illustration of with my wife, I was so thankful to have men in the church who came up alongside me. I had one mentor particularly. He was an elder at the church. He was a professor at Michigan State. He grew up with an alcoholic dad. He could relate to a lot of my experience. I got to watch his life, how he loved and raised and led his family. Most importantly, I got to hear from him tell me, Jeshua, you have what it takes. You can do this. And I would say over and over again, my life hasn't been perfect since then. I've made mistakes. But it's usually when I've looked at myself and I've allowed myself to be isolated. You see, we were created for connection. We were created to be in community. We were created to be in connection with a God who wants a personal relationship with us. And we were also created to be connected with other people. I'm thankful for CBMC. There are people here who have played those roles, who have been that connection in my life. And I'm thankful that Mike is going to come up and talk about an opportunity for that connection. So thank you very much for listening to my story.